you need a very specific persona who will kind of thrive in an environment like this. I don't think this kind of hustle is meant for everyone. You definitely need someone who's a more generalist in the way he operates, right? Like for example, he has to also have an entrepreneurial bent of mind. If you look at founders when they're bootstrapped, they don't have finance folks, right? They don't possibly don't even have someone in admin. They must be doing all the running around even for the basic admin and facilities things. So I mean, the degree of that keeps changing as you kind of keep growing. But the earlier the stage of the company, the more generalist the person is required to be, right? I think the finance controller, for that matter, who would thrive in a early stage company, to the one who's kind of going to thrive in a growth stage company, to the one who kind of will do extremely well in a public company. The personas are very, very different.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. If this is your first time here, we curate conversations with founders, operators, and investors in the Indian startup ecosystem. So learn how to sell, build, and do all of the other things that you have to really scale a startup. On this podcast, we have Jatin, who is the CFO at Fashinza. Jatin has been in finance for about 20 years. He's been a CFO at GoIbibo, Meesho, Wald, and now Fashinza. And here we talk about the CFO's top priorities. When is the right time for a startup to look for a CFO? What is their typical day like? What are the certain differences between a startup CFO and a corporate CFO? What is the makeup of their team? And so on and so forth. This was a very interesting conversation. I've not had a CFO on the podcast earlier, so it was really amazing to understand all of the different nuances. And I think Jatin really did a damn good job of explaining all of these. And I'm sure that you'll like it. So go ahead and listen to this. And if you like our content, don't forget to rate and review us on your favorite platform so more people can discover us. So here goes. Hey, Jatin, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey Roshan, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're recording this on a weekend as well. So precious time for us here. And I'm super interested in understanding everything about what a CFO does at a startup, right? Like I said, we have not had any CFO on the podcast earlier. So you're the first one, and we'd love to understand, what your priorities are, how your typical day is like, what your team is structured like, and all of the other nuances of your work. Let's begin with a little bit of context. You've been in finance for about 20 years. You worked with a lot of startups, GoIbibo, Meesho, and now Fashinza as well. You've been a CFO for, I think, a good amount of time as well. How do you get into startups, and more particularly this whole CFO thing? How did that happen?
So like you said, I kind of started my career about 20 years back, and my formative professional years were with some great companies. I started my career. I'm from Goa. I started my career with the Dempo Group in Goa, then moved to Nestle. Worked with Pricewaterhouse, GlaxoSmithKline. A good part of my pre-startup journey was with FMCG consumer companies, and I think those were great years in terms of learning with the kind of people that I worked. But when towards I think 2015, 16, when startups were becoming more and more mainstream, I obviously was kind of very keen on doing a stint in a startup, and working in a technology company. That was something which was I was looking forward to. IBIBO happened, and ever since then, I've kind of been with startups. Meesho was a phenomenal stint for me. I had a great experience there, and I think I've just enjoyed this journey. Very complimentary to what I've done in the past, but it's been a fun ride so far.
Amazing. Now, when you say CFO, Chief Financial Officer, I think broadly what we understand is that person is responsible for the financial health of the company. Irrespective of what the company is actually engaged in, you actually see a nice, clear balance sheet, right? I mean, left hand side, right hand side, and you keep us honest, right? I mean, in some sense, I think you guys are the moral compass of the company, irrespective of what the startup does. What are your top priorities as a CFO?
Sure. And I've kind of lived this model at GlaxoSmithKline, which was a very good stint for me. I learned a lot of things there. So we had this very nice finance framework which spoke about protecting value and adding value. Protecting value would typically include everything on tax, compliance, controllership, financial operations. And adding value would include everything around resource allocation, kind of doubling down on your revenue, profits, partnering with business folks, other cross-functional teams, etc. And I think outside into startups also include stuff like fundraising, investor relations, pursuing inorganic opportunities. So for me, that framework has stayed with me. I kind of learned it early on in my career, and that's something which I practice even today. Of course, the context changes from a large company into a startup, but everything that I do, the way I structure my team, the way I kind of plan my day out, I look at that framework. Everything has to kind of revolve around that framework for me. And maybe I'll talk about how a classical CFO's office is structured in a startup, right? You have typically a finance controller who looks at reporting, taxation, financial operations, revenue assurance. Then you have a business finance team, and the business finance team essentially is kind of working very closely with functional heads, be it business, marketing, operations. Kind of they're almost like mini CFOs partnering business leaders, acting like their sounding boards. Very closely embedded into those orgs. And then of course legal is again a very important function, which typically in startups reports to the CFO, unlike listed companies, etc., where more often than not that function reports into directly to the CEO. And there are different businesses where I think the kind of capital that you raise and the intensity of capital raise also could be very, very different, right? For example, in Fashinza today, for us, working capital is a very strong element of kind of in the balance sheet, and hence financing working capital through debt becomes a very important part of my job, and not using equity to kind of finance working capital. So unlike a pure play consumer marketplace or a SaaS company, where more often than not your working capital cycle is negative, very, very sharp focus on raising the right quality of debt, because there are different use cases, right? There could be on the receivable side, payable side, post shipment, pre shipment, depending on which geography you're kind of getting exposed to, whether you raise INR debt or US dollar debt. Typically, that's how the finance office is structured.
So, if I were to sort of rephrase what you said, I mean, you have the tax and audit guys, which is the financial controller. Then you have the business finance folks, I mean, who basically manage the P&L for each function or category, etc. Then you have the legal folks, and then you have the folks who are involved in the financing aspect of things. And here it's both the debt and the equity side of things, depending on what kind of business it is, right?
That's right. Maybe I'll talk of another aspect. I missed it earlier, Roshan. I think public policy, is very, very important in a startup journey. Many a times, when I've spoken to regulators, I've realized that they don't know what exactly the business is. Right. So, for example, early on at Misho, we were empowering micro entrepreneurs, giving them the software heft to kind of do their businesses, giving the right assortment and logistics, etc. Regulators were not kind of able to decipher that model, because people were used to a certain set of e-commerce models in India, right? The early models that we saw. But when we went, me and Vidit, we went and kind of met some of the regulators, policymakers. They were delighted with what we were doing. And I think the CFO is in a very strong kind of position to articulate the value proposition, how it's helping the broader ecosystem, maybe what kind of policy changes you need to support this business model. So that's again an important function, I think, in the CFO's office, typically in a startup.
When is all of this relevant to a startup, Jatin? Because I'm sure that on day zero no one will start with a CFO. Perhaps the startup has to reach a certain size, right? So at what point is a CFO and a CFO's office relevant?
The way I would kind of address a problem if I were a founder is finance is super important for the business, right? Irrespective of what stage you are at. I think the constraining factor becomes at what level or what kind of seniority or what kind of cost that person would come in. Depending on the stage that the startup is, they should certainly have some sort of a finance person on board, right? And more often than not, I've seen that Series B, Series C, and beyond, and especially for businesses which require strong element of kind of working capital financing, or even otherwise, investors kind of put their foot down and ask for a CFO. And I think at that stage, even the founder starts seeing the value of kind of having a full-time CFO on board. But I've seen a few kind of businesses where finance as a function, or HR for that matter, or legal as a function, have been ignored maybe early on in the stage. And I think the pain that those founders have gone through later on has been a lot, right? You might as well kind of invest in a junior resource, but have someone kind of at the helm over there.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a all too common problem, I feel, right? Because founders typically tend to be engineers, even if they're business folks. I mean, they're more on the sales and marketing side of things, or maybe product guys, right? I mean, you don't have folks from finance as such. And so that, finance is one of those skills that founders quickly have to learn, right? I mean, how to read balance sheets, how to sort of run P&L and so on. With all of these different priorities and such like a diverse set of things that you do, what does your typical day look like?
I think if I look at my day, including my life outside of work, I think fitness has always been a very important kind of part of the journey. Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, post COVID, that's taken a backseat. And I operated from Singapore for some time, especially during the peak of COVID, because my family is there, and working in different time zones, etc., etc. That took a backseat. But now I'm back in India. I'm really looking forward to kind of being more disciplined in my life. I think that just helps me to be better at work as well. Like I said, I've just started a new assignment. I'm in Delhi NCR now, and trying to kind of get back into the rhythm of health and fitness. But given that I'm in a new assignment, besides the framework that I just spoke about, it's very important for me to really understand the organization, what it needs. And given the rapid transformation that a startup goes through, it's very important to have a like a not just a 2 year or a 4 year view, but even a 3, 6, 9 months kind of a view, right? Because you need to kind of plan for your team, for resources, capital raise, etc., based on those that line of sight that you have. So, I mean, given that my vintage into the organization is barely 4 months now, I try and spend a lot of time with my counterparts who lead other functions, be it business, marketing, operations. That really helps me, to understand what their challenges are, how are they kind of looking at business, what is the support they need. And more often than not, it really helps you build empathy with what the other person is kind of going through. And how can you really partner with him and not just be a controller of sorts, right? How can you partner with him to scale the business, or solve other problems that he's facing. So besides the core finance stuff, and the other functional aspects that I spoke of, I try and make time for networking within the company as well as outside. Just gives me a broader perspective what's happening, and kind of just helps the learning and prioritization from my side.
I think especially when a senior person is hired in a startup, right? I mean, people have all of these hopes and expectations. They hope that the person will just wave a magic wand and instantly produce all of the results that people have been hoping for years, right? How do you work with a founder? How do you set those expectations in terms of, hey, here is where you are, and if we have to go to this point A or point B, it might take 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and here is how we're going to do it. And how do you get that buy-in from a founder?
Sure. No, I think that's a very relevant point you're making, and it sounds so familiar, right? I've been in this situation many a times, and sometimes not just with founders, but also other senior operators within the organization. Fortunately, I've seen early stage investors, and people who are on the cap table really helping founders, kind of make this, their senior leaders that they cannot get on board, especially for functions like mine, right, where there could be optically some sort of people would look at it as a CFO or a general counsel has come on board, so he's going to kind of put in more processes, slow down the pace of the organization, etc. But fortunately, founders are very very well aware of the implications of getting someone like the CFO on board. More often than not, all the organizations that I've worked for, they know what that role is supposed to be, what kind of repercussions it would have in the DNA of the organization or the pace of the organization. Having said, it's also my job to understand what the organization needs, right? I can't possibly operate like the CFO of, let's say, a listed company. And a venture funded company has its own priorities. It's supposed to operate in a particular way. It's supposed to be more nimble, and yet kind of balance out on everything on compliance, governance, etc. So it's for me to kind of play that fine balance. I need to be a good storyteller. This role requires the government to kind of build consensus with the founders, with your counterparts who are functional leaders, and tell them why we are doing what we are doing, right? I think more often than not, sometimes it's just communication gaps. When people see it as there's some sort of a new requirement that's coming to the organization, or some sort of new friction that's coming to the organization. But if you do a good job in explaining to people why that's required, I don't see any reason on people you're not getting a buy-in from other senior folks in the organization.
Yeah, but it's such a challenge, I mean, I think, startup ethos is that, move fast, break things and stuff. And in that kind of an ethos, compliance can be a four-letter word, right? But we've seen that, how startups tend to pay a huge price later on, right? Because some of these things tend to spiral out of control as you scale. And so, I mean, the point that you mentioned about senior leadership as well, right? I mean, whether it's, product, engineering, marketing, whoever else, not being seen as a blocker, right? Someone who's going to put a spanner in the works of all of their plans, and someone they have to get past or get around, right? I mean, that I think is a huge challenge from a finance perspective.
No, no, absolutely. And I think for early stage companies, most of the senior operators, haven't kind of seen, very large companies, and their ways of working, and very organized processes, etc. Right. So it's very important for you to kind of spend time with those folks, make them understand, why we need to do something, and what, even investors who would be coming in at growth stage, what would be they looking for. I think if you do that job well of articulating those requirements, the relationships become much stronger, and the friction in all these things kind of reduce significantly. At Misho, we used to have this value called speed over perfection, right? Like you said, kind of move fast, break fast, but course correct fast. I used to tell my team, for us it's speed and perfection, right? And fortunately, when you hire also, you need to kind of get those right set of people who understand, how a startup works, and what the startup really requires, who can adapt to that, that rigor and the hustle that's required.
Yeah. So how does the CFO's function kind of scale? I mean, if you were to look at, 0 to 1, 1 to N, right, you're hired at a Series B, Series C, maybe your immediate mandate is to set things in order, establish some kind of reporting to the board, have financial prudence, and so on, right? How does it evolve from there on to, let's say, an IPO and beyond that?
Sure. So my what I've observed, and especially because most of my initial years have been with very large companies, right? Is you need a very specific persona who will kind of thrive in an environment like this. I don't think this kind of hustle is meant for everyone. You definitely need someone who's a more generalist in the way he operates, right? Like for example, he has to also have an entrepreneurial bent of mind. If you look at founders when they're bootstrapped, they don't have finance folks, right? They don't possibly don't even have someone in admin. They must be doing all the running around even for the basic admin and facilities things. So I mean, the degree of that keeps changing as you kind of keep growing. But the earlier the stage of the company, the more generalist the person is required to be, right? I think the finance controller, for that matter, who would thrive in a early stage company, to the one who's going to thrive in a growth stage company, to the one who kind of will do extremely well in a public company. The personas are very very different. Sometimes you get really great folks who can reinvent themselves and adapt to the new requirements. But if you get a public company kind of finance person into an early stage kind of environment, you're setting them up for failure, right? I think as a leader, I need to kind of be very sure on what kind of person I'm picking for the role, and that's where to be honest, I spend a lot of time also, irrespective of which company it is. Given the fact that these companies scale so fast, it's also very very important to keep meeting people. My sense is I spend almost 20% of my time in hiring. I keep meeting people because more often than not you're hiring for tomorrow, right? There is a lead time. Getting good people would take you invariably 2-3 months, and 3 months from now the business would look very different. Possibly we need three more people, right? So when you have good people constantly on the radar, and you're constantly meeting good people, figuring out how they would fit into the new organization, that helps you move fast. The more you leave gaps in hiring, the more you're kind of slowing down the business. But I think generally, for operators, my own recommendation is, in earlier stages you need to be a more of a generalist. And I think as the organization kind of grows, investors, other stakeholders, they need specialists also for those roles, right? So that's how I kind of go about picking my people.
So, for founders who are listening to this podcast, right, how do they hire a CFO for their startup? What are those special skills that they have to look for, and really, beyond just the cultural fit as well, right? I mean, how do they know who's the right person for them at that particular moment?
Sure. So I think it's a very conscious choice from both sides, right? I think someone who's coming into that role, at a very senior level, he should also be aware of, what he's getting into, whether he's up for it or not. More often than not, I've seen, kind of founders doing multiple rounds of interviews, ref checks, getting them to do some assignments, to really kind of make sure that that person is going to fit in well into that ecosystem. Because if he's coming from a very large setup, that person really has to kind of reinvent himself for this role. I mean, if you go to any Fortune 500 company, any large listed company, right? All of them would have specialists. I mean, you'll have a guy only who's been doing tax all his life. Someone who's doing internal audit, more often than not, all his career, he would have kind of specialized in internal audit. Uh, you can't have that kind of mindset over here. You have to be able to kind of pick up different tasks. For example, legal, public policy. These are not things that classical finance kind of functions do, right? But most startups, the CFOs do this. They enjoy doing it, and that's because they come with a lot of passion into the company. They look at this role as more of an entrepreneurial role, and not just they don't look at themselves just as like an employee. That helps them kind of take on new challenges, kind of work on areas which contextually at that point of time are very high impact. and could give you exponential results in terms of the size of the business or profitability, etc. So I think culture fit and compatibility between founders and CFOs is super, or for that matter, any senior operator, not just the finance team, right, is super important. But more often than not, business operations is very close to the founders, right? Or technology. If you have a tech first company, one of the co-founders will invariably be a product and tech guy. Finance is something which is more often than not outside of their domain, and being able to kind of relate to each other, understanding what the other person needs, whether the founder or CFO, that's very important. I think if I think you kind of hit it on the culture fit part, everything else is kind of solvable. If the founder believes in the problem that's being solved and the mission of the company, I'm sorry, the CFO believes in it, he's also kind of going to take that additional leap of faith and be open for new challenges.
Yeah, and there again, hiring someone who has that sort of a previous domain experience as well might work well, right? I mean, so if it's an e-commerce platform, someone who has seen that before. If it's SaaS, someone who has seen that before, etc. Because I'm sure as you're talking about this, I can sense that there's a general skill set, of course, but those nuances and those differences really matter, right? Because that is what you're investing your time in, trying to understand the business as well in your early days.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I think first principles is something which is part of the DNA of every startup, right? And in most functions, you can kind of use first principles, gut intuition, but and same goes for support functions or horizontal functions like finance, legal, HR. But there are certain things which are very intrinsic to our roles, which are universal, whether you're working for an early stage startup or a growth stage startup or a a listed company, right? I mean, those things can't be taken away. So very important to kind of have strong focus on those aspects. If I just go back like 4 or 5 years, right, I would get I would get calls from headhunters asking for references, and every time you would tell them, give them a particular reference, the headhunter would invariably say he doesn't have startup experience. My response to them would be, you have to take a bet on someone, right? I mean, it's not that startups have existed in India forever. It's a fairly kind of new space that's evolving. So and most operators in traditional roles like finance, legal, they have kind of taken a plunge, and some of them have done really well. So yeah, I think my recommendation to founders as well as CFOs will be, maybe you should also talk to other founders who have hired CFOs, or large company CFOs, talk to early stage startup CFOs, and understand what the role requires before taking the plunge.
Right. So when you think about your career, right, I mean, can you think of a couple of anecdotes maybe where, things have, maybe the expectations weren't aligned, the founder was thinking a particular way, or, I mean, the CFO was thinking a different way, and, some learnings from that basically?
I think especially for for someone like me, right, who's come from very traditional companies. I mean, we would not even get to launch products, if we didn't meet like a certain gross margin threshold, right? And we would like kind of product launches would go on for anywhere between 18 to 24 months. We would ideate, debate, left, right, center. But here, if we decide to, let's say, kind of go into a new market, or launch a new product, or go after a new consumer persona, for example, you can't be spending more than a couple of months on ideation to kind of go to market. So for me, when I went through that kind of transition for the first time, it was a little tough. I kind of struggled with it, but and I really strongly recommend is the 0 to 1 book, right? I think that really details this out very well, and I think it becomes even more relevant for folks like us, from horizontal support functions, because we are trained to think in a particular manner, or more often than not our previous experiences have taught us to operate in a slightly different way. When you go through that book, you realize that founders have strong reasons for doing what they're doing, right? And it kind of helps you build empathy for what the way they're thinking, and also partner with them more effectively. So yes, I mean, initially it was a huge kind of change for me, huge transition, but I'm hoping that my current founder will not be complaining on that aspect.
Well, I'm sure you won't. This whole fundraising process, right? I mean, that's another key part of your job as well. And I've seen that closely a couple of times, and I've realized that the way you model, the way you show your revenue and so on and so forth, right? The way you recognize revenue itself, I mean, you can go by two, three different ways, right? I mean, and again, depending on whether it's an e-commerce platform or whether it's a SaaS company, etc. There's things like GMV, gross merchandise value, or contracted ARR, etc., etc. There's just so many of these things, right? So with the fundraise process as such, right, how do you reflect the best value of the company? I mean, here specifically you could talk about e-commerce since that's your domain, right? I mean, how do you ensure that for an investor the company is as lucrative as possible?
Sure. I think the way I look at it, and maybe it's unpopular opinion, but my own view is the earlier the stage of the company, the more time the founder has to kind of spend on fundraising, because I think beyond a certain stage, articulating the economics of the business, etc., becomes a lot easier, right? You have PMF, you have more predictability in the business. It's a lot easier, but at an early stage, if I were to wear my early stage investor hat, right, what essentially I'm doing is I'm betting on the founder and his ability to kind of bounce back, whether it's COVID, not COVID, funding winter, no funding winter. You're kind of betting on that particular individual and his resilience and how he can fight different real life situations. He being a talent magnet, I think that's another very very important aspect. Founders have to be have the ability to attract strong operators. So founder plays a very very important role in the fundraising process. I think maybe series C and beyond, let's say you have a CFO on board, the CFO is to really complement the founder's skill set, right? The founder has to dream big, have a like a vision. The founder, the CFO can partner with him and articulate, what is the value proposition for the investor, right? Kind of, if he sharply kind of defines that the economics of the business, that becomes an extremely winning combination. I have at Misho, I got the opportunity, and possibly for the first time in my life, to kind of raise capital at scale. I've gone and represented Misho before $1 trillion funds, and one of them actually wrote the largest check for us in the Series F. But reality is, while I kept that relationship warm, I nurtured that relationship. They had to kind of meet the founder. They had to hear what Misho is from with it to kind of put a check finally. So I think it's a very complementary role, very important for the CFO to kind of define the value proposition very sharply from an investor's lens. But there is no way, I see an investor kind of putting a check without, getting a lot of conviction in the founder and his ability to, lead teams, to build businesses, to scale that business manifold.
Yeah, because I think the story is so important, right? And the mission is so important. This is what you hear from Ashwath Damodaran as well, right? I mean, where he says that all the numbers and the Excel sheet calculations are one thing, but then how you read those numbers, right, and what the numbers project in terms of the story, that is really the key to valuations as such, right? In these times, right, where we're seeing the macro environment is not that great, 2022, the funding winter and slowdown, all of those things, right? What does a CFO do differently right now, aside from, of course, riding a little hard on the budgets and and whatnot? What does the CFO's execution look like in a slowdown?
Sure. And maybe this is, there's one very generic, kind of aspect to this whole thing, right? And that's like having a very, very robust planning process. We would, in fact, in all the large companies that I've worked for, we would have a rolling forecast where you would kind of have a 1+3, 4 quarter kind of view. One quarter would be firm, and a rolling forecast for three quarters from now. That really kind of helps you figure out, how is your burn looking like? Because more often than not, companies at our stage, haven't turned profitable. What kind of runway do you have? How is your equity debt looking like? Do you see any concerns over there? When do you go for a fundraise? So that's something, irrespective of whether you're in a bull cycle, bear cycle, that's something that is oxygen, right? That's something you just can't, miss out on doing. Then I think it really depends on what the markets are kind of rewarding at that point of time, right? In 2021, what was being rewarded was growth at any cost. Narrative is like diametrically opposite today. A lot of focus on economics, having a more sustainable business model, etc. So very important to kind of course correct. You have to kind of understand what the market needs, whether you have private investors or public investors. The other important aspect, and now that I moved to a B2B kind of a business, right, Fashinza, I realized that the kind of exposures, or the kind of risks, if I were to define the top, let's say, 5 risks for a business like ours vis-a-vis a pure play marketplace business, are very very different, right? In certain businesses, you kind of have working capital, you have credit exposures, you possibly also like maybe in a commodity business, you're exposed to volatility over there. If you have foreign currency borrowings, you're exposed to kind of volatility over there, as against, let's say, a pure play SaaS or enterprise SaaS, or a B2C e-commerce business, where more often than not you're getting paid in advance. You have a subscription model, or you kind of have a negative working capital. Considerations are very very different. So one has to contextualize on what your business is, what are the exposures that you are kind of battling with. And certain businesses, for example, I think very very important to have a very strong risk person, underwriting person, to make sure that you're not don't have any kind of blind side towards some of these things.
Yeah. And this whole regulatory component, right, which you mentioned as something that you have to take care of, that as well, right? I mean, do you have a team, or I mean, is it something that is front and center for you, especially because some of these, like if you were to operate in fintech, for example, or even healthcare, right? I mean, regulation can make or break you, right? I mean, so that something that you spend a lot of your time on?
Absolutely. In my current role, regulatory compliances, legal is very integral to my role. I mean, if you look at the founder and his direct reports, right? I don't think there's anybody better placed to kind of do that role in the organization. You need to have a good view of the business, and also the regulatory policy, how it's evolving. How can you, in fact, more importantly, kind of work with regulators and explain your value proposition, your business model to them? Because many a times, if that doesn't happen, there's a lot of ambiguity on what business you're doing, and the regulators are not in sync. So very important to do that. I've seen certain businesses, fintech businesses, etc., where someone who's aspiring to be a neobank, etc. They of course hire much more regulatory folks, and maybe some of those positions roll up into the founders. But it really depends on at what stage the company is. I think today where we are, that's something very important from my own priorities.
So we've covered plenty of different nuances of the CFO and what the person does, right? If you were to pitch the role of a CFO to a founder, right, why they should hire a CFO, if you were to kind of summarize it in maybe like 2 or 3 points, what would you say?
I think just stepping outside of your core functional areas of finance, legal, tax, resource allocation, etc. This role is I think someone in this role can be a real very strong sounding board to the founders. Kind of speak about how the environment is changing, how we need to change our priorities. Be like his co-pilot of sorts, right? Be his one of the kind of strongest positions in his team, who can advise him on how our business needs to kind of contextualize and change to external changes. I think stuff like the functional aspects that I spoke of, they give you, that holistic view, on how where the business is headed, how the macro is trending, how can our business kind of adapt to the new world, not just from economics, but even maybe from a regulatory view. I think that makes this position, an extremely important position as far as the founders are concerned.
Amazing. Yeah. That's how I read it as well, right? I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's perhaps the most complementary skill set to a founder, right? I mean, who's from an engineering or product background. That's number one. The number two thing I see is that, the CFO looks at the business the way an investor would look at the business as well, right? So that's a very important sort of a layer for the CFO to sort of reflect how an investor would kind of look at the business, very no nonsense, look at it as a balance sheet and so on, right? And of course, most importantly, I mean, it lets the founder focus on what they want to do, right? I mean, whether it's product or sales or whatever else. I mean, you keep the lights on, basically, right? You make sure that there's enough money to go out and chase your dreams and live your mission, basically.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think once the CFO comes on board, if the founders are still kind of need to spend time on these aspects. Firstly, I think that there is a need for the CFO to kind of up his game, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely, I think it's a very complementary skill set, and you're also having that investors lens when you kind of play your role as CFO. bang on.
Fantastic. So, Jatin, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think it's been a great tutorial for me, right, in terms of what a CFO does. And I'm sure the audience will appreciate this as well. Before we leave, any books, podcasts, or resources that you would recommend? I mean, you could suggest any general things, or, I mean, any finance related stuff as well for founders and so on.
Honestly, I really need to kind of improve. I'm not a big podcast person. I really need to kind of read up more often. I generally keep, myself updated with whatever is going on in the ecosystem, whether the regulatory ecosystem or generally in business models, etc. In fact, I would like strongly recommend a 0 to 1 book for startup operators, especially from people who are coming from support functions from large setups to a startup. It'll really help them understand what the founder is doing. How can you add value in your roles in this new in their new jobs in a startup. That book has helped me tremendously.
Fantastic. So, thank you so much for making the time, Jatin. I really appreciate it and wish you all the best for everything that you have coming up.
Thank you so much, Roshan. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform. Also get updates delivered straight to your WhatsApp inbox by clicking on the link in the description.